Welcome everyone to our GraphQL in production panel. My name is Matt DeBergalis. I'm founder and CTO of Apollo, and we're really excited to have had a chance to have this conversation last week and again this week. A lot of it's been about some really interesting questions about the technology. We just saw the talk from Ashi on the future of federation. We've been talking about caching and performance and security, different languages. What I was hoping to do with this conversation is bring together four experts that have put all those pieces together and, as you'll see, in four very different settings, to roll out a significant GraphQL API for their organizations at scale and behind some really important business critical software. And so I wanted to welcome our four panelists here and have a conversation about that. We've got Shruti Kapoor from PayPal. We've got Mike Byrnes from Priceline. And Andy Vajda, I hope I pronounced that right, forgive me, from American Airlines. And Marc-Andre Giroux of GitHub. So welcome all four of you, and thanks for taking the time to join us. Mark, maybe I can start with you. You literally wrote the book on production GraphQL, and just to start us off, what's your advice on teams that are going down this path? What have you learned that you'd want to communicate to anyone who's maybe at the point where they've got a first GraphQL investment up and running? They probably have a lot of questions. A lot of them have been discussed here in the conference, but more broadly, what's next? And what would you point them toward?
Right. I think the first thing I will say is start slow. It's definitely a big investment, and going all in without the proper tooling and developer experience and visibility into what's happening in production, it's quite a challenge. It has huge benefits that we talked a lot about during conference, and we see a lot, but I would definitely be saying start slow and invest in proper tooling, invest especially in visibility into what's happening during execution of GraphQL queries. So if you have a good way to see what happens when that query hits your servers, what downstream services are getting hit, what data sources are getting hit, in what ways. This has been the most challenging aspect I've seen so far, and also the one that's solved the least, I feel. There are solutions to monitoring resolver timings, measuring timings in general, but having like a complete visibility and having that peace of mind that you know if a query is going slow, you know why, has been the most crucial thing I've seen so far.
And I think in your case with, excuse me, with GitHub, there's such a prominent public API. And for those who don't know, Marc-Andre was also at Shopify, where there's another prominent public GraphQL API. So maybe one angle on this is to ask, and I'll start with you and then go around here, to what degree was this planned out, and was there a concept of how that may all tie together? And to what degree was this more of a bottom-up or an agile, one thing at a time approach? I'm curious how those two fit together in your experience.
Right. For me, especially at GitHub, I came a bit after these kind of initial decisions to go with GraphQL is, and I think the reasons why we use GraphQL have evolved as well over time, which is, I see that often a lot too. At first, people use GraphQL for almost everything. For us, it's been kind of like more and more targeted as we go on. Having a public GraphQL API makes like all the hard things about GraphQL even harder, but all the beautiful things about GraphQL are really beautiful in terms of a public API as well. Our integrators have been asking for ways to customize our REST endpoints for years, and with GraphQL we can offer that so well. But on the other side, all these performance, visibility, and complexity of our servers also is quite a challenge. So yeah, for us, the public API part is awesome to give to our clients, and just, yeah, there's things to watch out for, which we can probably talk about once we see what others have to say.
Yeah, we can circle back to public APIs toward the end. Shruti, at PayPal, my understanding is there's dozens of teams that have adopted this, and I wonder if you might speak about what that journey's been like and how it's spread, and what the path from the beginning to where you are now has been like.
Yeah, so when I actually started with GraphQL at PayPal, we only had a handful of teams that were using GraphQL. There was a team that was pioneering the use of GraphQL at PayPal, and that kind of became like our mentor team to go ask for help. And that's kind of how our journey started. So there was one team that started experimenting with GraphQL, figuring out what needs to be done, and then other teams at PayPal started adopting GraphQL slowly, and that's kind of where we are right now. A lot more teams are starting to adopt now. There's a lot more tooling at PayPal now for GraphQL. And the journey has been that slow, like Mark was saying, like slowly teams will start adopting, we'll figure out what are the hurdles, and then we'll build tooling around it to kind of solve that. One thing that has helped us in our journey so far is having like sample apps. So the first few teams that built GraphQL, the client side and the server side, they build sample client side and server side apps. So now any new team that wants to adopt GraphQL, we kind of point them to that direction. And that has been really helpful.
Mike, what's your experience been at Priceline?
So at Priceline, we kind of started, I guess, a grassroots movement when GraphQL was first announced. We had one team that thought it was really cool and could help us out, so they kind of took it on as a pet project and implemented it. And then it got other teams looking at it, saying, "Hey, this is really cool, and this could help us out." So it kind of snowballed from there till we got all of our front-end teams implemented their own GraphQL services as kind of translation layers or back-end for front-end type implementations. So it got to the point that we had, all of our teams had their own graph, and we were sharing some knowledge, but it was kind of fragmented. Everyone kind of managed their own thing. With the introduction of Apollo Federation and the Gateway, we're starting to come together, and we've got a center for GraphQL knowledge, and we're going to start to merge some of these graphs and reduce some of the duplications that we've got there.
And Andy, I think for American, there's been maybe a bit more of a multi-team coordination effort from the beginning. I wonder if you can speak about how at American this has been different in any way from what we've heard so far.
Actually, a lot of the same patterns and issues have come up. Fragmented initially. Federation has kind of brought all that together. So my team at this point is leading the charge in Federation, and it's really a snowball type situation right now where it started off slow and it's just going downhill full steam with teams wanting to be onboarded and take part in it. So exciting times, lots of work to do, but we have a very fragmented, siloed structure in, every team is doing their own thing, and we're trying to change that culture. So that's really been the challenge.
I'd love to spend some time on that topic and how it spreads from team to team. And I'll just say, and those of you who just heard Ashi's talk will have picked up on some of this in her comments too. When we first started thinking about Federation, we were really thinking about more of maybe a top-down or a coordinated design. And what we're finding is, I think Marc-Andre's guidance is exactly what we've seen many teams doing. It's been our own journey. We have a GraphQL API to no one's surprise, and it ends up being a lot more agile and ad hoc. And what we're finding is a lot of teams that are adopting Federation are doing it not so much from first principles, but to bring together a lot of what's already emerged. And we're interested in tools and in extensions to that concept that help teams come at this more from the bottom-up perspective. So let's talk about how it spreads. And Shruti, maybe I can ask you, you've got some GraphQL, you see adjacent teams that are interested in using the same thing. You talked about example apps. What have you found works best to help teams, or what have you found would help if there were more of to accelerate that spread?
Yeah, so I think for us, the biggest thing that helps is talking about numbers, which I think works for any enterprise. So, for example, at PayPal, we have a bunch of REST APIs, right? So, a team that is integrating with like 6 or 7 different REST APIs needs to go and call these APIs every time they need to make a query or get some data. And then we talk about the REST payload that we get. So all of the data that we're getting out of that, we're only picking up a few fields, and how much of that data are we throwing out. So for us, what has helped us is like showing those numbers, like showing this data that has been throwing out, and how GraphQL has been helping us in kind of like cleaning up that data that we send to our front-end applications. That has kind of been the driving factor. We do a lot of tech talks around it, showing our fellow engineers how that's been working, how easy it is to adopt GraphQL, how you establish a contract, and then the front-end and back-end teams kind of work off independently. That's how we've been motivating our teams to get on board.
And let me just ask everybody to jump in here. What other thoughts or experience have people had?
I can definitely feel the snowball effect Andy was talking about here, especially for us. If teams want their new feature to be exposed in GitHub's public graph, well, the more features there are there, the bigger our graph becomes. It really is that snowball effect. And I think on the technical side of things, what we've noticed is if you make the developer experience of adding things to the graph great, and if you make it in the right abstractions that developers are used to, it's going to be way easier than coming all in with maybe GraphQL concerns that they've never seen before and trying to sell them on GraphQL. For us, it was kind of we took a different approach where we kept it to abstractions that we're used to on the Ruby side of things, like active record, and we build our graph in ways that they were used to for other things, like building database records, for example. So I think building the right abstractions and having a great developer experience will just make that so much easier than coming up with a bunch of new ways of doing things. Of course, there isn't that adaptation that needs to be made, but we've tried making that transition as smooth as possible from what developers were used to.
I would echo that sentiment. We've done a lot of work to make the developer experience better, especially trying to standardize some of the way that we've been implementing GraphQL services. Like I said before, we were very fragmented. So it took a little bit of education to go from one graph to another, or make changes in one service or make changes in another. Another thing we've done a lot of is just GraphQL education. We don't have a lot of GraphQL experts. We have people that have worked on graphs and know the way that their service works, but there are a lot of people also that just know of GraphQL, but not of all the features of the power that we get from GraphQL, especially from Federation or the Gateway. So we put together some comprehensive education programs that we've rolled out to both development and product teams to educate everybody.
I feel like I'm just going to repeat what everybody else is saying. We're doing the same things. We're working on training for onboarding teams. We're building Terraform scripts to onboard teams into cloud deployments, because that's also new for our organization. The evangelizing of GraphQL, we have a large polyglot ecosystem that's very segmented. So trying to make sure that everybody's desires are met as far as capabilities. You know, some teams want to work in Java, some want to work in .NET, others in Node. So we have to be able to support all that. And making that developer experience seamless and painless is really our goal.
And maybe I can turn it around. What hasn't worked, or any cautionary tales or missteps that we could share for those watching?
I would say one of the biggest things that we want to look at is schema design. So thinking about what data you actually want before implementing a schema. I would think is very helpful. We find ourselves in a lot of positions where we just graft existing REST endpoints. So the data doesn't really look like anything that the front end or apps teams may need. It just looks like the same data that we had before with a different way to request it. As we've grown, we've gotten a little better at that in implementing UI components and then building the schema based on what those components need and nothing more. But I would say if you're just starting out, think about the schema that you want to produce.
For us, one of the challenges has been error handling and mapping the 200 error that we get from GraphQL into something meaningful, especially because our errors are like very minute. So we have like for 400, we might have so many different errors that we might be showing for like a validation error. At PayPal, we have the specification for how we throw errors. So kind of mapping GraphQL's 200 errors to that specification has been a challenge, and we've been working on that.
I can definitely relate to the errors from. Sorry, do you want to go ahead, Matt?
No.
Okay, yeah, I can definitely relate to errors for us, especially coming from a public API perspective. Trying to see, let's say we have a timeout in certain queries to kind of stop a query if it's taking too long. Trying to see if that query was actually, let's say, malicious or just asking for too much data, or is it our systems that's too slow? Kind of getting that visibility into, is something going wrong, or is the person simply asking for too much data? And those problems are very different and have different consequences. So definitely getting visibility into what's happening error-wise.
Yeah, I've read Mark's book. So we're going with the error handling or errors as data concept that seems to be working out pretty well. I would say that caching has been just a challenge. It's been a challenge. Each microservice presents its own needs and requirements. So we've been spending a lot of time talking about caching and strategies around that.
What's the people side of this? So sometimes I think about maybe one of the real special things about GraphQL is how it lets multiple teams work side by side without stepping on each other's toes quite as much, where, I own my piece of the schema, you own your piece of the schema, or you have your graph and I have my graph, and the code isn't so entangled. It's plausible to bring those things together the way you can bring React components or Docker containers together without really being inside each other's stuff. And it makes me feel like there's a people or a social impact that this has as it spreads across the org. I know that's a pretty vague topic, but I'm just curious if anyone can talk about what they've seen in terms of how GraphQL has changed the way teams work together or build applications or user experiences together that you might point at as a thing to watch for others as they go down this path.
I'll go ahead and start, I guess. At AA, we're really working on developing a governance standard and fine-tuning that to handle conflict resolution, making sure that we're always hitting the authoritative source and really trying to reduce silos, because I keep mentioning that, but we're very segmented and fractured and everybody has copies of the same data, that sort of thing. So defining who's the owner, provenance, data lineage, and doing that in a structured, collaborative way. So that's been a challenge for us, but we're working towards that.
A lot of the same stuff that we're working towards as well, trying to get collaboration between product, front end, back end developers to understand the needs of the customer, the needs of the feature, and to build out that way with communication. So while everybody may have their own piece of the graph to administer or work on, we have to understand where those pieces are, where each piece of data lies and who the actual owner is, and what pieces may just be extensions that are needed for a one-off or, only for this app, only for this page of the site, and trying to pull that apart while keeping a cohesive definition of what each domain object is and who's the owner of it. So we've seen a lot more communication, especially with our bigger initiatives that are thinking graph first.
And I'm curious just to dive into that. How do you do that? It feels like a new kind of discipline. How do you decide in a world with a bunch of duplicated data in silos where that's going to live and how the teams resolve those questions?
It's been a little tough for us right now because we have so many pieces of data that are duplicated across our products. We've got hotels, flights, rental cars all on their piece, but then checkout has a copy of those and post booking has a copy of those. So we're still working on who's the owner, and it may come down to who owns the inventory versus who owns the content and that kind of stuff.
Trudy, I know at PayPal there's, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sure. I think for us, what's funny on that part is that as far as finding an owner for a certain feature, we're lucky enough that there's probably already an owner because GitHub's domain can be accessed from so many different ways already, right? The REST API, the GraphQL API, the UI itself. So generally a certain feature has a certain owner already, and we try not to change that with GraphQL. So we really want the feature team, the specialists of that feature, to own all the ways you can access that feature, including GraphQL. So I think that would be something very important, where sometimes you have an API team like we do, or a GraphQL team, and that team is really useful as well. But being careful and having the people that know the features best work and own parts of the schema. And I think for us, the SDL, the power of the schema, makes that much easier than in other areas. So as others were saying, we can annotate certain types within an area of responsibility and ownership, code owners, for example. So if I change a certain type, the feature team will be required for a review, for example. So this has all really been useful.
Trudy, you want to go or you want me to?
I think I was just going to add to what you were saying, Andy. We kind of have this fragmented approach as well. And with GraphQL, one of the things that we've seen work really well in terms of a social impact is breaking the silos of teams, because we're all building like this GraphQL endpoint. We have kind of started working closely with other teams together that have already built GraphQL or are building GraphQL. So adopting those best practices across the organization this size has been something that GraphQL is helping us. Like, we're communicating with these teams a lot more. We're taking their help. We're reaching out to the specifications team and the web platform team. So bringing the entire organization closer, I think GraphQL has helped us a lot in that.
Okay. From my team, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
In our world's current climate, I think cost reduction and savings is really a key thing that everybody's trying to do. So convincing product teams that they need to, start using GraphQL to break down these silos is really one of the things that we're trying to do. So if we can reduce the impact to their product, that they have to maintain infrastructure or sets of data that's duplicates of existing things that they don't own. If we can sell them on that as a cost reduction, then that's really kind of how we're trying to target that. Is let's become smaller, more efficient, and optimize what we have, do things the right way, and we can break down those silos, and keep using that word and get it tattooed.
Yeah, and I think something we've seen, this pattern is so interesting to me, where most APIs, I think, historically have come from the data side or the backend side, and some of these questions just don't emerge in that pattern. But with GraphQL, we often see it begins with the product team or the UI team, and so for the first part of the journey, there's actually more stuff rather than less stuff, because you still got all the original REST APIs or BFFs or whatever you started with, and you've layered on these GraphQL APIs to help the individual teams. And the prize is when you start either connecting them together or having a common view of all of that, and you start measuring success and how many of those BFFs could I retire, or how much code could I eliminate, or how much consolidation could we do? And I feel like that's something that we could, I like the earlier point about numbers and measurements, and let's put something quantitative behind this. Maybe that's one of the big takeaways. We have a few minutes left, and Marc-Andre, you started by talking about the public API at GitHub, and maybe I can just broaden this and ask everybody to just talk about what's next for you, and how do you see the path forward for the next year or so, and what's your goal or aspiration that maybe others can come away with and think about for their organization?
Sure, I can talk about a few things. I think one thing I'm really excited about, and I don't think we'll solve that, but I'm excited in general about GraphQL, is finding new ways, new execution schemes and new ways to execute a GraphQL query, because the way GraphQL's execution is really powerful. It's what allows clients to really like select what they need and GraphQL to give that right up. So that's great. But it's so powerful. I find it shapes a code base with GraphQL execution in mind, something you don't necessarily always want. So what I'm really excited about is if we can find a way where you can have people write business logic in a way that's kind of GraphQL agnostic, so that it can be reused different places. And especially in terms of data loading, having a way where I can write simple code for what I want in my resolver, and GraphQL execution is going to make that efficient somehow. I think data loader approach is great, but it does impose a shape to a code base where everything is in terms of data loaders now. Everything is asynchronous. So I'd love to find a way around that. On the public API side of things, I would say just more tooling for visibility, really being able to see what's going on in our system, finding out if a client's having issues with slow queries before they reach out to us has been the real challenge. Because with GraphQL, we're dealing with like millions of different queries, which if you think about it is almost like maintaining millions of REST endpoints because everybody's selecting their own thing. So monitoring that is a huge challenge. So this is something I'm really interested in.
From our side at Priceline, we're looking over the next year to consolidate some of our current graph schemas and reduce some of the redundancy that we have, kind of collapse that down into single domain objects with single owners, get rid of some of the no longer needed backend for front-end services that we have, or at least transfer the ownership of that code to backend service. And we're really excited to get all of our front-end and our mobile apps teams calling our graph through a single endpoint. I think that'll be a really powerful thing for us, be able to monitor all that from a single point instead of having to monitor 7, 10, 12 different applications.
Yeah, for us, we're pretty excited about that single endpoint as well, and having a unified GraphQL API across all of our applications. One thing that I'm super excited about or looking forward to is authenticated or GraphQL API that is seamless. So an authenticated and unauthenticated flow with GraphQL API should become as easy as like switching between or like adding a directive. So I'm really looking forward to that solution hopefully soon. And dev tooling as well around GraphQL.
Yeah, reduction in our footprint, our infrastructure is one of our key driving metrics. It's a cost savings. And I need to go back and watch Ashi's talk from before this because the Federation and what's coming next is very, very interesting, very cool. Especially around the streaming, the live, the defer, all of that stuff is it's like candy to me. I just want to eat it all up. So,
yeah, I think the way I look at this is about empowering teams to do better work. And what I'm hearing in all of these examples is let us focus on the stuff that actually brings value to our users and that we came here to do. And I think the graph is a good example of, we've seen other things like, I mentioned Docker earlier. Containerization empowered teams to write services, and you didn't have to bring all that particular expertise anymore just to have a API endpoint in your environment. And I'm very hopeful that what we see over the next couple of years is just this spread. It really is a network effect, and it means that as GraphQL spreads in the organization, team after team can, hey, I came to work to make a great user experience, not to shovel data around. And I think being able to do that at scale across all of the data in the organization is such a prize. I want to thank everyone. Any last thoughts from anyone here for our audience?
I would echo the point that Mark said earlier. Don't be scared of GraphQL. Just get in little by little.
I would say be patient when trying to evangelize. Some teams aren't ready for it.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
I have a friend here at Apollo that says, start small, think big. So that's the way to do it. I think we're hearing across the board. Thanks so much to all of you. And I hope you're all safe and healthy. And I really enjoyed doing this. I hope we can see each other in person soon, but having a chance to bring this message to people just around the globe and who are doing this in all kinds of companies, large and small, I think is a real privilege. So appreciate it and be well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.